The Krethian warships had arrived 50 years ago, and the skies above New Terra had not seen a clear sunrise since then. Commander Sarah Chen stood at her office window, watching the patrol drones drift through the perpetual gray haze that now covered the human colony world like a funeral shroud. And she wondered, not for the first time, how many generations would have to pass before children stopped asking their parents what the sun looked like. The Krethians called it protective administration, but everyone knew the truth. Humanity and 17 other species were conquered territories, nothing more. Sarah's badge glinted in the artificial light streaming from overhead panels. Compliance Officer, Human Colonial Division, Krethian Empire. Each word a small betrayal she swallowed every morning when she pinned it to her uniform. Her job was simple in theory. Ensure humans met their quotas, resolve disputes between colonists and occupiers, maintain order. Prevent incidents that might give the Krethians an excuse to demonstrate why they had ruled the galaxy for 300 years. The door chimed, and Marcus Okonkwo entered, his shoulders hunched in the way all humans carried themselves now. A reflexive attempt to appear smaller, less threatening, beneath notice. "Commander Chen," he said quietly, keeping his eyes down, as protocol demanded when addressing anyone with authority under Krethian law. "Marcus, please sit." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk, her voice softer than regulations required. She had known Marcus for 15 years, had attended his wedding, had brought gifts when his daughter Maya was born. He lowered himself into the chair, and Sarah noticed the fresh bruises on his forearms, purple and yellow, the colors of pain that the Krethian sonic batons left behind. "The patrol caught you short on quota again?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. His jaw tight. 3 units short on the mining allotment, and they said, his voice cracked slightly, they said next time they would take it out of my family's ration instead of just my body. Sarah's hands clenched beneath her desk where he could not see, her fingernails cutting into her palms. The quotas were designed to be nearly impossible to meet. She had figured that out within her first month as compliance officer. But pointing out such things to Krethian administrators only brought questions about one's loyalty. "I will note the disciplinary action in your file as completed," she said formally, then added in a lower voice, "and I will arrange for supplementary rations to be delivered to your quarters." Marcus looked up, gratitude and shame warring in his eyes. "You do not have to. Consider it administrative compensation for exemplary service record," Sarah interrupted, using the bureaucratic language that would justify the action if anyone reviewed her decisions. After Marcus left, Sarah pulled up the colony statistics on her display screen. 20,000 humans on New Terra, spread across 5 settlement zones, all working in the processing plants that refined the rare minerals the Krethians extracted from the planet's crust. The quotas had increased 17% over the last decade, while the equipment remained the same aging machinery that broke down more often each year. Children were required to attend Krethian educational facilities where they learned the Empire's history, a sanitized version that painted the conquest as unification and occupation as guidance for primitive species. Sarah's screen flickered to show the day's incident reports. 6 workers injured in Zone 3 due to faulty equipment. 12 citations for insufficient productivity. 1 arrest for seditious communication, which probably meant someone had complained about working conditions within earshot of a monitor. The Dreadlords enforced it all. They were the Krethian Empire's enforcers, 7 feet tall, with armor that amplified their already impressive strength, carrying sonic weapons that could rupture organs or simply cause enough pain to make grown adults weep. Dreadlord Vexthor commanded the New Terra garrison, and Sarah had learned to recognize his presence. Particular brand of cruelty. He never used lethal force, because keeping populations alive and terrified proved more effective than mass executions. Fear worked better than death, the Krethians had discovered long ago. Sarah remembered the first public punishment she had witnessed after becoming compliance officer. A young man caught with banned literature, poetry written in old Earth languages, stripped and placed in the central square, while sonic pulses broke bones one by one, as the entire colony was forced to watch. The young man had survived, but he never walked properly again, and no one spoke of poetry anymore. A notification appeared on Sarah's screen. Evening curfew in 2 hours. All humans to return to residential zones. Any violations would result in immediate detention. She began the shutdown protocols for her office, filing reports and updating compliance logs, performing the administrative dance that kept her valuable enough to maintain minimal privileges, like the ability to move between zones or access to slightly better food rations. The walk to her residential unit took her through the market district, where vendors sold what few goods the Krethians permitted: basic foodstuffs, simple clothing, repair materials for household items. Everything was gray or brown, or the color of dirt, because the Krethians believed bright colors promoted emotional instability in subject populations. Sarah passed the school, a low rectangular building where human children spent 8 hours daily learning mathematics, basic science, Krethian history, and obedience. Maya Okonkwo would be there now, Sarah thought, probably in the afternoon session with the other 8-year-olds. She had met Maya a few times, a bright child with curious eyes who asked questions adults had learned to stop asking. Why do the Krethians not smile? And when will we be free to choose our own work? Keep such questions private, spoken only in the safety of their quarters, where monitoring was less intensive. Sarah reached her unit as the warning sirens began their wailing call. 30 minutes until curfew. All humans indoors, doors sealed, movement prohibited until morning. She entered her small apartment, locked the door, and sat in the darkness without turning on lights. Through her window, she could see the Krethian tower in the distance, illuminated and imposing, a constant reminder of who held power. Somewhere in the colony, Marcus Okonkwo would be returning to his family, probably moving slowly because of the bruises, probably trying to smile for his daughter, so she would not worry. Somewhere above, Dreadlord Vexthor would be reviewing patrol schedules and enforcement quotas, calculating how much fear to apply to keep productivity high without triggering actual rebellion. And somewhere in the administrative databases Sarah maintained, the statistics showed what no one dared say aloud, that 50 years of occupation had broken something fundamental in humanity's spirit, that children were growing up who had never known freedom, that resistance had become a word from history rather than a possibility. Sarah sat in the dark and felt the weight of her badge, even though she had removed it and placed it on the table. Tomorrow would bring more quotas, more citations, more small cruelties disguised as administration. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day before, and all the days stretching back 50 years. She did not know, could not know, that tomorrow would instead bring an incident that would crack the foundation of everything the Krethian Empire had built through terror. She did not know that Maya Okonkwo's bright, curious eyes would close for the last time. She did not know that the inferno was already gathering, waiting for a spark. The morning alarm shrieked through the residential zones at precisely 0600 hours, as it had every morning for 50 years, pulling Sarah from dreams of open skies she had only seen in archived photographs. She dressed in her gray uniform, pinned the compliance badge to her chest, and tried not to think about how the weight of it seemed heavier each day. The morning reports came through while she ate her ration bar, tasteless but nutritionally complete, as the Krethians prided themselves on efficient sustenance delivery. Zone 4, minor equipment malfunction, production delayed by 40 minutes. Zone 2, compliance at 97%. Zone 5. Her communicator buzzed with an emergency override code, Commander Chen, report immediately to Educational Facility 7, the automated voice stated, using the flat, emotionless tone that always preceded bad news. Sarah's stomach clenched, and she was moving before her conscious mind fully processed the implications. Educational Facility 7 served the children from Marcus Okonkwo's residential block. The streets were already filling with workers heading to their assigned posts, everyone moving in the efficient, subdued manner that the Krethians expected. No running, no loud voices, no unnecessary gestures that might draw attention. Sarah's compliance badge allowed her to move against the flow of traffic, and other humans stepped aside quickly when they saw her approaching, their faces carefully neutral. The educational facility came into view, and Sarah's heart sank. 3 Krethian security vehicles were parked outside, their lights pulsing in the red-orange spectrum that the Krethians used for enforcement situations. Dreadlord Vexthor stood near the entrance, his 7-foot frame encased in the black armor that had become synonymous with fear throughout the colony. "Commander Chen," he acknowledged her with the barest nod. "We have a situation requiring administrative documentation." His voice carried the harmonic undertones that all Krethians possessed, multiple vocal cords creating layered sounds that humans found unsettling. "What happened?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice professionally steady despite the dread building in her chest. "Routine contraband inspection," Vexthor replied, gesturing toward the facility entrance with one clawed hand. "Suspected resistance materials hidden within the educational facility, and during the search, an incident occurred." Sarah knew that Krethian euphemisms were carefully chosen. Incident meant someone was hurt. Situation meant someone was dead. And routine meant they had been looking for an excuse. Inside the facility, the children sat in perfect rows in the main hall, their faces pale and tear-streaked. Teachers standing along the walls with expressions of barely controlled horror. In the center of the room, covered with a gray blanket that did not quite hide the small shape beneath it, lay the reason for Sarah's summons. "The child made a sudden movement during the inspection," Vexthor explained, his tone suggesting he was reciting from a script. "I responded according to protocol for potential hostile action." Sarah approached the blanket, on legs that felt disconnected from her body, and she knelt beside the small form. She already knew, somehow, before she pulled back the fabric. Maya Okonkwo stared upward, with eyes that would never again ask curious questions, her small chest still and silent. The sonic pulse had hit her directly. Sarah could see the telltale bruising. Patterns spreading from Maya's sternum, the hemorrhaging that occurred when sonic weapons were used at close range on targets too small to withstand them. She was comforting another child. A teacher's voice came from behind Sarah, shaking with suppressed rage. Little Timothy was crying because the Dreadlord's weapons scared him, and Maya put her arm around him, and the Dreadlord thought. "Silence," Vexthor commanded, and the teacher's voice cut off abruptly. The child's movement pattern matched threat assessment parameters, and I responded appropriately to neutralize potential danger. Sarah stood slowly, carefully folding the blanket back over Maya's face, her hands moving through motions, while her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. An 8-year-old girl, dead because she tried to comfort a frightened classmate. Dead because a dreadlord with a sonic weapon designed to incapacitate adult warriors had fired it at a child. "I need witness statements," Sarah heard herself say, the words coming from training rather than conscious thought, "and full documentation of the inspection protocol." "Already prepared." Vexthor handed her a data tablet. "You will file this as accidental casualty during lawful enforcement action. Death occurred due to subject's unexpected movement during security operation." Sarah took the tablet, her fingers gripping it hard enough that her knuckles went white. She had filed such reports before. Workers injured due to failure to follow safety protocols. Civilians detained for suspicious behavior. But this was different, in a way that made her entire body feel cold. "The parents?" she asked. "Will be notified through standard procedures," Vexthor replied, already turning away as if the matter was concluded. The body will be released for disposal according to human customs after documentation is complete. Disposal, Sarah thought, as if Maya was waste material, rather than a child who had loved stories and asked impossible questions. The teachers were ushering the traumatized children out of the hall, moving them to other rooms where they would try to resume lessons as if nothing had happened, as if they had not just watched their classmate die. Sarah looked down at the tablet in her hands and read the prepared report. Subject exhibited sudden movement consistent with aggressive posturing during authorized security inspection. Enforcement officer responded with appropriate deterrent measures. Subject's physical structure insufficient to withstand standard sonic pulse frequency. Death ruled accidental casualty. No disciplinary action required. The words blurred on the screen, and Sarah realized her hands were shaking. She had signed dozens of reports like this, had told herself that her cooperation kept worse things from happening, that her position allowed her to help people like Marcus Okonkwo with extra rations and administrative favors. But Maya's small body, under the gray blanket, destroyed every rationalization Sarah had constructed over the years. She was not helping anyone. She was just making the occupation more efficient. Outside, through the facility's windows, Sarah could see normal life continuing. Workers heading to factories, patrol drones drifting through gray skies, vendors setting up market stalls. No one knew yet that something fundamental had changed. Sarah's communicator buzzed again. Commander Chen, status report required. Acknowledge documentation completion. She looked at the tablet, at the prepared words that would classify Maya's death as acceptable procedure, at the signature field waiting for her authorization. Her finger hovered over the screen. In her mind she saw Marcus Okonkwo's bruised arms, heard Maya's voice asking innocent questions, remembered 50 years of small compromises that added up to complicity. Sarah pressed the signature field, authorizing the report, feeling something inside her chest crack and break, even as she completed the bureaucratic ritual. Transmitted to Krethian administrative databases, officially recorded. Maya Okonkwo was now a statistic, a line item in colonial management records, an accidental casualty. Sarah removed her compliance badge and held it in her palm, staring at the metal and plastic that represented her authority under Krethian law. She had worn it for 8 years, had believed it gave her the power to make things better, had convinced herself that working within the system was the only realistic option. But badges did not save children from sonic weapons. Compliance did not prevent murder disguised as protocol. And all her careful documentation only made the machinery of occupation run more smoothly. Outside, a notification chimed across the colony's public network. Educational Facility 7 incident resolved. No operational impact. All quotas remain in effect. Somewhere in the residential zones, Marcus Okonkwo was receiving notification that he needed to run. Report to Administrative Building 3 to claim his daughter's body. Somewhere in the Dreadlord Tower, Vexthor was probably filing his own report, never doubting that his actions were justified and proper. And somewhere in the databases Sarah maintained, Maya's name was being added to lists she had helped create, systems she had helped maintain, an occupation she had helped sustain. Sarah walked out of the educational facility into gray morning light, still holding her badge, and she knew with absolute clarity that she could never pin it to her uniform again. The question was not whether she would resist. The question was how and when and what price she was willing to pay. By evening, whispered conversations would spread through the residential zones, passing from quarters to quarters in hushed voices. Marcus Okonkwo's daughter, they would say. Only 8 years old, they would say, dead for trying to comfort a frightened child. By tomorrow, white ribbons would begin appearing, tied to doorways, worn on sleeves, small acts of mourning that the Krethians would not immediately recognize as resistance. And in the days that followed, Something that had been dormant in humanity for 50 years would begin to wake. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days after Maya's death, following the standard mourning period that Krethian regulations permitted for civilian casualties. Sarah expected perhaps 50 people to attend. Family members, close friends, neighbors who knew the Okonkwo's well enough to risk association with an incident family. Instead, thousands came. They gathered in the designated mourning area just after dawn, before work quotas began, moving through the gray streets in streams of silent humanity. Each person wore something white: ribbons tied around arms, strips of cloth pinned to clothing, pale scarves wrapped around heads. The Krethians had no cultural association with the color white, so the gesture meant nothing to them initially. Just another peculiar human custom during grief rituals. But to the humans gathering in the mourning area, white was the color of children's innocence, of purity destroyed, of something precious that could never be recovered. Marcus and his wife stood beside Maya's simple casket, their faces hollow with grief that went beyond tears. Sarah stood with them, no longer wearing her compliance badge, dressed in civilian gray, with a white ribbon tied around her left arm. "Commander Chen should not be here," one of Marcus's relatives whispered nervously. "The Krethians will think—" "I am not Commander Chen anymore," Sarah replied quietly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I resigned my position yesterday, and I am here as a human being mourning a child who should still be alive." The crowd continued to grow, filling the mourning area and spilling into the adjacent plaza, thousands of people standing in absolute silence. Children stood with parents, elderly workers leaned on younger ones, entire family groups gathered together in shared grief. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself was a statement that the Krethians had not yet learned to interpret. At precisely 0800 hours, the work quota alarm sounded across the colony, signaling that all workers should be at their assigned posts. No one moved. The alarm repeated at 0805, louder and more insistent. Still, no one moved. Sarah could see patrol drones circling overhead, their sensors sweeping across the massive gathering, undoubtedly transmitting data back to Krethian command. At 0810, Dreadlord Vexthor arrived with a full security detachment. 20 armored Krethians carrying sonic weapons, their formation designed to intimidate. "Disperse immediately," Vexthor's voice boomed across the plaza, amplified through his armor speakers. "You are in violation of assembly regulations and work quota requirements." The thousands of humans did not disperse. They simply stood, looking at him with eyes that held something the Krethians had not seen before. Not fear, not submission, but quiet, absolute defiance. "This is your final warning," Vexthor announced. "Disperse or face enforcement action." Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself between the Dreadlord and the crowd. "They are mourning a child," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the stillness. "They will disperse when the funeral rites are complete, not before." Vexthor's helmet turned toward her, and she could see her reflection in its dark surface, a small human woman facing a warrior designed to inspire terror. "Former Commander Chen," he said, and something in his tone suggested he understood the significance of her presence. "You are encouraging regulatory violations." "I am attending a funeral," Sarah replied, "as is my right under even Krethian law, which permits mourning periods for immediate family and community members. Exceeds reasonable community parameters." Vexthor gestured at the thousands of people. "This is organized resistance activity." "This is grief," Sarah countered, "and if you fire on mourners at a child's funeral, you will create something far worse than resistance." For a long moment, Vexthor stood silent, and Sarah could almost see the calculations running through his mind, weighing enforcement protocols against potential consequences, measuring the cost of letting mourners finish their ritual against the precedent of allowing defiance. Finally, he stepped back, and his security detachment followed. "You have 1 hour," he announced. "Then all personnel will report to assigned workstations, and this gathering will disperse." The Crethians withdrew to the plaza perimeter, forming a containment line that made clear they were watching and waiting. The funeral proceeded in continued silence. Human custom adapted to wordless necessity. Was carried by her father and uncles to the cremation facility, and the entire crowd followed in procession. Thousands of people moving as one organism through streets that had never seen such unified action. At the cremation facility, Marcus spoke briefly, his voice breaking. "My daughter asked questions," he said. "She wanted to know why we accepted things the way they were. And I told her it was necessary for survival. And now she is dead because she tried to comfort a frightened child." He paused, looking out at the sea of people wearing white, and his expression shifted from grief to something harder. Maybe survival is not enough anymore. The crowd remained silent, but something electric passed through them. Understanding, recognition, a shared realization that had been building for 50 years. After the cremation, the people dispersed, as Vextor had commanded, returning to workstations and residential zones. Ribbons. By midday, the ribbons had spread to other settlement zones as word of the funeral traveled through communication networks that the Crethians monitored but did not fully understand. Humans had learned to speak in implications, in shared cultural references, in codes that were not really codes at all, but simply the language of people who had known each other for generations. By evening, work productivity across all 5 zones had dropped to 70% of quota, not because of equipment failure or deliberate sabotage, but because workers were moving slower, taking longer breaks, making small errors that required time to correct. The Crethians increased patrols and issued citations for insufficient productivity, but the slowdown continued. In Zone 3, a maintenance crew working on mining equipment discovered a faulty relay that would fail within days, and instead of reporting it for repair, they simply noted it in maintenance logs and moved. In Zone 5, administrative workers processing supply requisitions began making small data entry errors, transposing numbers, misrouting shipments, creating delays that seemed accidental but compounded across systems. In residential areas, evening gatherings became common. Families visiting neighbors, sharing meals, speaking in quiet voices about things that had been forbidden topics for 50 years. Sarah attended one such gathering in Marcus's residential block, sitting with 20 other people in a cramped apartment designed for 4. "They will increase enforcement," someone warned. "They will make examples of us." "They have been making examples of us for 50 years, another voice replied. "And now they made an example of an 8-year-old child." "What can we do?" The question came from an elderly woman who had lived through the initial conquest. "We have no weapons, no ships, no way to fight them." Sarah spoke into the silence that followed. "We do not need to fight them," she said. "We need to stop helping them." The room turned to look at her, and she continued. "The Crethians conquered us with military force, yes, but they rule us through systems. Systems we maintain, systems we operate, systems that require human expertise because they could not be bothered to learn them themselves." Understanding began to dawn on faces around the room. "The refineries," someone said slowly, "run on protocols that only human engineers fully understand." "The administrative databases," another added, "use classification systems developed by human programmers." "Supply chain logistics," a third voice joined, "shipping routes optimized by human analysts." "Communications networks," someone else contributed, "maintained by human technicians." Sarah nodded. "For 50 years, we have been so focused on survival that we forgot a basic truth. They need us more than we need them, and they do not even realize it." "Realize it. But if we sabotage critical systems," Marcus said quietly, "they will execute us." "Not sabotage," Sarah corrected. "Withdrawal. We simply stop being helpful, Stop being efficient. Stop volunteering information or solving problems, or going beyond minimum requirements. She looked around the room, at faces weathered by years of occupation. We become precisely what they always claimed we were. Primitive, inefficient, barely capable of following simple instructions. And we watched their empire stumble because it was built on our hidden competence. The gathering continued late into the night, long past curfew, but no patrols came to break it up. The Krethians were still trying to understand why thousands of humans had gathered for one child's funeral. Still analyzing the significance of white ribbons, still calculating the appropriate response to productivity decreases. They did not yet understand that the funeral had been a spark, and the white ribs were not mourning, but declaration. Across New Terra, and spreading to the 46 other human colony worlds through communication channels. The Krethians monitored but could not fully control. A message was passing. Remember Maya Okonkwo, it said. Remember what they take from us, it said. And remember that we hold the power to make their systems fail. In her quarters that night, Sarah stood at her window, looking at the Krethian tower in the distance. And for the first time in 8 years, she smiled. The inferno was gathering, and the Krethians, who ruled through terror, had not yet noticed that the foundation beneath them was beginning to crack. 3 weeks after Maya Okonkwo's funeral, the Krethian Empire experienced its first major systems failure in 200 years. It began on New Terra at 0600 hours, when the automated quota tracking system crashed, taking with it production schedules for all 5 settlement zones. By 0700, similar failures were cascading through 46 other human colony worlds. By 900, Krethian command centers across 3 sectors were reporting critical malfunctions in logistics networks, supply chain management, and administrative databases. None of the failures were catastrophic on their own. No life support systems went down, no weapons malfunctioned, no ships lost navigation. But together, they created a paralysis that spread like infection through the Empire's infrastructure. Dreadlord Vexthor stood in the New Terra Command Center, watching error messages scroll across display screens, while his technical staff struggled to understand what was happening. "Human technicians in here immediately," he ordered. "I want these systems operational within the hour." The human technicians arrived, examined the failures with careful attention, and delivered their reports with expressions of professional concern. "The database corruption is extensive," one explained, showing complicated diagnostic readouts that meant nothing to the Krethians. "Recovery will require complete system reconstruction from backup files." "How long?" Vexlord demanded. "Difficult to estimate," the technician replied. "The backup files themselves appear to have integrity issues, possibly from cumulative data degradation over years of deferred maintenance." "We perform maintenance on schedule," Vexlord growled. "Physical maintenance, yes," the technician agreed. "But software systems require different protocols, and the documentation for those protocols seems to be incomplete." What the technician did not say, technicians across 47 worlds said, was that the documentation was incomplete, because humans had written it that way, deliberately creating systems only they fully understood, building in dependencies and complexities that made the Krethians reliant on human expertise. For 50 years, humans had been the invisible architects of occupation infrastructure, and now they were quietly withdrawing their knowledge. In the mining facilities, production quotas could not be calculated because the tracking systems were down. In the refineries, material processing continued but at drastically reduced efficiency because optimization algorithms were malfunctioning. In administrative centers, personnel records became unreliable, supply requisitions went missing, and communication routing degraded to manual operations. The Krethians tried to force compliance through their standard methods: increased patrols, additional citations, public punishments for workers accused of sabotage. But how could you punish someone for a computer system crashing? How could you prove that a technician was being deliberately unhelpful rather than simply incompetent? Humans responded to interrogation with carefully constructed ignorance. I do not know why the system failed, they would say. I am just following the documented procedures, they would say. And when pressed, they would produce technical documentation so dense and complex that even Krethian military analysts could not determine if they were being deceived. Meanwhile, productivity continued to fall. Not dramatically, that would have been too obvious, but steadily, consistently, across every human-operated system in the Empire. 70% of quota, then 65, then 60. The Krethians increased pressure, but humans had discovered something powerful. Coordinated incompetence was nearly impossible to punish. Sarah coordinated resistance activities from her residential unit, using communication networks that the Krethians had always monitored, but the happiest never truly controlled. She sent messages disguised as personal correspondence, embedding instructions in complaints about system failures, spreading tactics through shared technical discussions. Remember, she wrote in one widely distributed message, we are not saboteurs. We are simply workers who need better training, clearer documentation, more time to complete complex tasks properly. The beauty of the strategy was its deniability. Humans were not refusing to work. They were just working slowly, making mistakes, needing constant clarification of instructions. And beneath the surface, human engineers and administrators were systematically withdrawing the expertise that made Krethian systems function. Ambassador Trell of the Vexari arrived on New Terra 4 weeks after the system failures began, requesting an audience with Krethian leadership. The Vexari were a neutral species who maintained diplomatic relations across the galaxy, and their ambassadors were granted certain courtesies even in Krethian space. Trell was escorted to Vexthor's command center, where the Dreadlord was reviewing the latest productivity reports with mounting frustration. Ambassador, Vexthor acknowledged, his tone barely civil, has no need for neutral mediation in internal administrative matters. I am not here to mediate, Trell replied, his scaled features arranged in what might have been concern or amusement. Krethian translators were notoriously poor at interpreting Vexari expressions. I am here to warn you. Warn us? Vexthor's posture shifted to something more aggressive. About what? About the fact that your empire is collapsing, Trell said bluntly, and you have not yet noticed because you mistake symptoms for causes. He activated a holographic display showing star charts marked with declining production statistics, failed system nodes, and logistical bottlenecks spreading across Krethian territory. You believe you are experiencing technical failures, Trell continued, but what you are actually experiencing is the withdrawal of human cooperation, and the difference is critical. Humans are working, Vexthor objected. Quotas are being met, systems are being maintained. At 60% efficiency and falling, Trell interrupted. And you assume this is because humans are primitive and inefficient. But you have forgotten something important. These same humans built the systems you rely on, and species that can build complex systems are never as primitive as they appear. He pulled up historical data showing human technological development before the conquest, architectural achievements, scientific innovations, and organizational capabilities. Humans survived on a death world, Trell explained, a planet with extreme weather, aggressive predators, and resource scarcity that should have eliminated them before they developed agriculture. But instead, they thrived by becoming the galaxy's greatest problem solvers and systems thinkers. They are conquered, Vexthor stated flatly. Their technological capabilities are irrelevant. Their technological capabilities are the foundation of your administrative infrastructure, Trell countered. 90% of your logistics systems were designed by human programmers. Your supply chains are optimized by human analysts. Your equipment is maintained by human engineers, and all of it was so seamlessly integrated that you never noticed your dependence. Vexthor was silent, and Trell pressed his advantage. 3 weeks ago, you killed a human child for comforting a frightened classmate, and you filed it as acceptable procedure. But what you actually did was give humans a reason to stop pretending they needed you more than you need them. We can force compliance, Vexthor said, but his voice lacked conviction. You can force presence, Trell agreed. You can make humans show up to workstations, follow basic instructions, perform minimum requirements, but you cannot force expertise, and you cannot force people to volunteer the knowledge that makes complex systems function efficiently. Display and looked directly at the Dreadlord. Your empire was built on military conquest, but it was maintained through administrative systems you did not understand, and now those systems are failing because the people who understood them have decided to withdraw their cooperation. Then we will replace them, Vexthor declared. Train Krethian technicians, rebuild systems with Krethian expertise. That will take decades, Trell pointed out, and you have perhaps weeks before critical infrastructure begins failing in ways that threaten your military capabilities. Outside the command center, another system alert was sounding, this time from the orbital refueling station, where human technicians had just discovered that fuel processing efficiency had somehow dropped to 40% of normal capacity. Across the galaxy, similar reports were flooding into Krethian command. Navigation databases becoming unreliable, communications experiencing unexplained delays, supply shipments being misrouted, maintenance schedules falling behind. And in every case, human workers were present, apparently doing their jobs, following documented procedures, but somehow nothing was working as efficiently as it had before. Sarah received confirmation codes from contacts on 17 different colony worlds. Phase 2 was ready to implement. Phase 2 would remove human specialists from non-essential Krethian positions, medical staff, technical advisors, administrative coordinators, creating failures in systems the Krethians had not even realized humans maintained. Are we sure about this? Marcus asked during an encrypted communication. If we pull our people from Krethian medical facilities? They have their own doctors, Sarah replied. They will survive, but they will notice how much worse their healthcare becomes without human nurses and technicians supporting their systems. She sent the activation code, and across 47 worlds, human specialists began requesting transfers, citing stress, health concerns, or simply exercising resignation rights that Krethian law technically permitted. Within days, Krethian military hospitals were experiencing staff shortages. Research facilities were losing technical support, and command centers were operating without the human administrators who had been handling routine tasks for 50 years. The empire was not collapsing, but it was stumbling, and the Krethians who had ruled through terror for 3 centuries were discovering that terror could not fix broken systems or restore lost expertise. In her quarters, Sarah received a message from Galactic Council representatives requesting information about human grievances and potential negotiation frameworks. She smiled and began drafting a response that would begin with a simple statement. We have one non-negotiable demand. Dreadlord Vexthor must stand trial for the murder of Maya Okonkwo. The Empire refuses. We will continue withdrawing our cooperation until their entire administrative infrastructure collapses. The inferno was rising, and the Krethians were finally beginning to feel the heat. The Krethian High Command called an emergency session 6 weeks after Maya Okonkwo's death, gathering military leaders from across 3 sectors to address what they were now calling the human situation. Supreme Commander Krethvin reviewed the cascading failures with growing disbelief. Productivity down to 40% across all human colonies. Critical system malfunctions spreading to non-human territories. Other occupied species beginning to adopt similar, slow compliance tactics. How did we not see this coming? Krethvin demanded, his multi-toned voice resonating with frustration. Humans presented as cooperative, one advisor explained. All performance metrics indicated acceptable integration into Empire administrative frameworks. Acceptable integration? Krethvin pulled up the latest reports. Our supply chains are failing. Our communications networks are degraded. Our logistics systems require manual oversight. Acceptable. The humans are still working, another commander objected. They have not refused duties, or engaged in active rebellion. No, Krethvin said slowly, realization dawning. They have done something far more effective. They have made themselves irreplaceable, and then become incompetent. He displayed historical data showing human technological capabilities before conquest, complex systems engineering, advanced problem-solving methodologies, adaptive organizational structures. We assumed they were primitive because they fell to military force, Krethvin continued. But military strength and technological sophistication are not the same thing, and we have spent 50 years relying on their sophistication without acknowledging it. Dreadlord Vexthor stood to address the assembly. We can still restore order through enforcement, he argued. Increase punishments, make examples, demonstrate consequences for inefficiency. We tried that, replied a voice from the rear of the room. Kraft then replied coldly. Productivity decreased further, and the Galactic Council is now formally investigating our occupation practices, because Ambassador Trell filed reports about the child you killed. The assembly fell silent, and Vexthor's armored frame seemed to shrink slightly. The child made a threatening movement, he began. The child was 8 years old and comforting a frightened classmate, Krathvan interrupted. And you killed her because your protocols do not distinguish between combat situations and school inspections. And now that single action has given humans the moral justification to destroy our administrative infrastructure without firing a shot. He deactivated the displays and turned to face the assembled commanders. We have two options. Escalate to mass executions and watch 17 other occupied species rise in coordinated rebellion, or negotiate. The Empire does not negotiate with conquered populations, objected simultaneously. The Empire also does not collapse because technicians work slowly, Krathven countered, but that is our current trajectory unless we adapt. The debate continued for hours, military pride battling against practical necessity, until finally Krathven made the decision that would change the Empire forever. Contact the Galactic Council, he ordered. Inform them we are willing to discuss terms. The negotiations took place on neutral Vexari territory, with Ambassador Trell serving as mediator. Sarah led the human delegation, joined by representatives from the other occupied species who had watched humanity's resistance with growing interest. Krathven led the Krethian delegation, though he had left Dreadlord Vexthor behind on New Terra, a calculated decision that both sides understood as significant. We are prepared to offer improved working conditions, Krathven began. Increased rations, reduced quotas, limited administrative autonomy. No, Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but absolute. We did not withdraw our cooperation for improved conditions within occupation. We withdrew our cooperation because occupation itself is unacceptable. You cannot expect the Empire to simply abandon territories we conquered, a Krethian advisor objected. We expect the Empire to recognize that conquest without consent creates systems that collapse when consent is withdrawn, Sarah replied. And we are demonstrating that reality through every malfunctioning database and delayed supply shipment. She activated a holographic display showing the spreading failures. This is week 6, she explained. By week 12, your military supply chains will be critically compromised. By week 20, your communications infrastructure will require complete rebuilding. By week 30, your ship maintenance schedules will begin missing critical service intervals. You are threatening military systems, Krathven observed. No, Sarah corrected. We are simply explaining the natural consequences of administrative collapse. And administrative collapse is what happens when you build an empire on the expertise of people you treat as conquered labor. What are your demands? Krathven asked directly. Sarah's response was equally direct. immediate autonomy for all occupied territories, full political independence within 2 years, economic reparations for 50 years of forced labor, and Dreadlord Vextor stands trial for the murder of Maya Okonkwo under neutral Galactic Council jurisdiction. The Krethian delegation reacted with predictable outrage, but Krathven raised a clawed hand for silence. "And if we refuse?" he asked. "Then we continue our current strategy," Sarah replied, "and you watch your empire fragment. As other species adopt our methods, and your military might becomes irrelevant because you cannot navigate space, cannot process food, cannot maintain ships, and cannot coordinate forces without the administrative systems we built and now refuse to maintain. You would doom yourselves as well," one Krethian argued. "Your colonies depend on empire supply networks. Our colonies have survived on less," Sarah countered. "Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us daily, and we learned to build resilient systems precisely because we could not rely on external support. So yes, we would suffer, but we would survive, and your empire would not." Ambassador Trell interjected. "If I may offer perspective," he said diplomatically, "the humans have demonstrated something the galaxy has not seen before. Successful non-violent resistance against a military superpower, and other occupied species are taking notes." He displayed reports from Vexari intelligence showing similar movements beginning among the Tarathi, the Sesic, and the Mindran. All species conquered by Krethian military force, all now watching human tactics with intense interest. "If you refuse human demands," Trell continued, "you will face coordinated resistance across 17 species, and while you can certainly defeat any of them militarily, you cannot force them to competently maintain the systems that make your empire function." Krethen was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Military commander confronting a problem that military force could not solve. "We need time to consider these demands," he finally said. "You have 1 week," Sarah replied, "and for every day past that deadline, we implement the next phase of withdrawal." She did not specify what that next phase was, but the threat was clear. Humans still had cooperation they could withdraw, expertise they could withhold, abandon. The week passed with intense internal debate within Krethian High Command, factions arguing for military crackdown versus pragmatic acceptance, pride battling against survival. On the 8th day, Krathven transmitted a response that shocked the galaxy. The Krethian Empire would accept human demands. Autonomy granted immediately, full independence within 18 months, reparations to be negotiated, and Dreadlord Vexthor would be remanded to Galactic Council jurisdiction for trial. The trial became the most watched legal proceeding in galactic history. Vexthor stood before neutral judges, his armor removed, facing charges of excessive force resulting in civilian death. His defense argued protocol compliance, threat assessment procedures, standard enforcement practices. The prosecution presented Maya Okonkwo's school records, her teacher's testimony, security footage showing an 8-year-old child putting her arm around a frightened. The judges deliberated for 3 days and returned a verdict that sent shockwaves through military establishments across the galaxy. Guilty of disproportionate force. Guilty of failure to assess actual threat level. Guilty of causing civilian death through reckless application of military protocols in civilian context. Vexthor was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment under Galactic Council supervision, and Krethian military doctrine was formally reviewed and reformed to prevent similar incidents. For humans across 47 worlds, the verdict meant something profound. Justice was possible, even against those who ruled through terror. Sarah returned to New Terra 3 months after the verdict, no longer a compliance officer, but an elected representative in humanity's new autonomous government. She visited the memorial that had been erected in Maya's honor. Not a monument to war or military victory, but a simple statue of a child with her arm around another child. Eternal comfort frozen in stone. The plaque read, Maya Okonkwo, whose death awakened conscience, whose memory inspired change, who reminded the galaxy that the smallest acts of kindness are the foundation of civilization. Marcus Okonkwo stood beside the memorial, as he did most days, and Sarah joined him in silence. "She would have been 9 next month," Marcus said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied. They stood together, watching children play in the plaza, where thousands had once gathered in silent defiance, where white ribbons had marked the beginning of something that changed the galaxy. Other species came to study what humans had accomplished, non-violent resistance that succeeded not through moral persuasion, but through strategic withdrawal of cooperation. Human advisors began working with the Torathi, the Sesek, and the Mindran, sharing tactics and strategies, helping other species understand their own. Indispensability. P. The Krethian Empire did not collapse, but it transformed, forced to renegotiate relationships with species it had conquered, learning slowly that rule through terror was unsustainable when the terrified controlled the systems that made ruling possible. And in schools across former human colonies, children learned about Maya Okonkwo, about how one child's death became the catalyst that proved humanity's true strength was never in matching the violence of their conquerors. Their strength was in being essential, in building the systems everyone relied on, in understanding that the people who maintain infrastructure hold power that military force cannot overcome. Sarah looked up at the sky, now clearing as human environmental engineers began reversing 50 years of atmospheric neglect. And she thought about how far they had come. From occupied populations to autonomous worlds, from compliance officers to elected representatives, from terror to justice. All because a little girl tried to comfort a frightened child, and her death reminded humanity of something they had forgotten, that survival was not enough, that dignity mattered, and that the people who build civilization hold the power to make it work or watch it fail. The inferno had risen and burned away the foundations of empire built on terror, leaving in its place something humanity had always possessed but rarely recognized: the quiet, unstoppable power of essential competence withdrawn. And the galaxy would never be quite the same.